This video is brought to you by Squarespace. There was a moment post-World War II where we had finally achieved world peace. Don't look over there, stop looking. The entire world had got over their squabbles and we all held hands. Stop looking over there. And we had finally declared an end to all human suffering. Alright, fine. We'll talk about Ireland.
The head of it.
A 30-year war of bombing campaigns, civilian deaths and collapsing governments, this traumatic conflict has gone on to be a defining part of Irish culture to this day.
I don't make any bones about killing. Anyone that comes into my house and my country and tries to take over by force, I'm going to kill him, and I'll use any and every means to do it.
I would say that the deaths of British troops in Ireland for the first time in 50 years would be a definite advantage to the Irish.
How old are you guys?
I'm 14.
15.
And why is it that you're fighting against the police?
Harassing bastards.
My gosh, Michael, wow, look.
We're in the home of the enemy, Kathleen.
Michael,
Hey, 1,000 years,
just
Kathleen.
enjoy your holiday, Michael.
Cameron and Trace, I'm in.
Michael,
Good luck
there's
to you,
no
laddie.
need. There's no need for any
Go away,
of this.
Richie.
Michael, what? Michael!
Alright, so England had been fucking around with Ireland for a long time, but it would be in 1541 where we would take full control of Ireland, creating plantations. And Ireland is considered the first British colony. And we took over and we realised they were all Catholics. And it's kind of a bit awkward because we'd just become Protestants. So I'm sorry, lads, but we're gonna have to eradicate your culture. We banned them speaking the language. We banned them playing their music, practicing their faith. They couldn't own land. They weren't allowed good jobs. And that had an effect on them. And by the end of 1703, Irish Catholics, despite making up 90% of the population, only owned about 10% of the land. It created many uprisings, and famously the potato famine, which was as a result of bad British colonial policies. However, as much as we wanted to, we failed massively at erasing Irish culture. In fact, it kind of did the opposite. This persecution created a shared struggle, a solidarity amongst Irish Catholics. And as well, like any good identity, it created an enemy, a deep hatred, a deep resentment for the British colonial power. So we have to understand the conditions that the Irish Catholics were in, because there was a legal enforcement of discrimination against the Irish. And the discrimination resulted in major inequalities in jobs and housing and wealth in general.
By almost every measure, nationalists in Northern Ireland were second-class citizens.
I'd fought for 18 years in the army for liberty and freedom, but because I'm a Catholic, I cannot get freedom.
The British media would constantly talk about how the Irish are this inferior race. I don't know if you know, but they were pretty racist back then, and Irish people weren't considered white. They were considered genetically barbaric and backwards. This, of course, created a two-tier society whereby the English and Scottish Protestants were better off, as they were kind of just handed large chunks of Irish land for free. And in the mind of the Catholic Irish, it created a narrative that all British Protestants were the enemy.
This is where we're from. This is Catholic. This is a Republican there. This is Ireland, not England. It's just back there where they're from. Not all welcome here on the bog side or anywhere on free day. And if we do, they will be met with sustained attack.
So by the 1900s, a lot of blood had been shed. And after a long process, Westminster, why do I always call it Westminster, were finally giving a vote to the idea of Irish independence.
From the pro-treaty majority in the Dáil, a cabinet was chosen. Griffith became president, with Collins as his right-hand man and the real leader of the treaty party. Others who'd risked their lives for the ideal of an all-Ireland republic couldn't bring themselves to settle for less. De Valera and other Republicans repudiated the treaty.
However, Ireland would eventually get its independence in 1921. Sort of. So a big chunk at the top in a province called Ulster. 6 of the counties within that drew a border around it and they remained in the United Kingdom, splitting Ireland into two. The Protestant-dominated North and the Catholic South, which became known as the Free Irish State.
The result of an Irish election has never before hung so much in the balance. So great is the interest aroused over the issues at stake in the election that a record poll is expected in one of the most momentous political struggles in the history of the Irish Free State.
And like, you know, it's kind of an awkward one, right? Because obviously the British had invaded Ireland, but this, you know, that was fucking 500 years ago. And due to those plantations, the North became very Protestant dominated. Protestants had lived there now for hundreds and hundreds of years. They had their own unique history, their own unique culture, and they had their own identity. They didn't feel connected to the rest of Ireland. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is without doubt the #1 platform for building your own beautiful looking website. With their new design intelligence, which combines the newest AI technology, plus their many years of expertise creating the best looking website template, you can now literally bang in prompts into the AI and it will create a bespoke website that's perfectly unique to your brand. On top of that, if you're going to be selling products, their payment systems are brilliant. If you've got customers all around the world, Squarespace now accepts tons of different payment providers and it makes it easier than ever. From Klarna to ACH Direct Debit, Apple Pay, and you can even offer buy now, pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. And also, like, doing all the copyright on a website can be a bit boring, especially if it's like product descriptions. But Squarespace's Blueprint AI means that you could just type in the really important information and then ask it to write you some copy. And of course, you can just go back, tweak it, and change it to sound like your voice, but it just saves you so much time and energy. So be sure to head over to squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant, and to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code Jimmy the Giant. Anyway, back to the video. You have to bear in mind, because Northern Ireland and the connection with the UK, it became the first part of Ireland to industrialise. And so it became much wealthier than the South, who were kind of stuck with more like less profitable agricultural industries. But the thing is, Northern Ireland wasn't just Protestants. It was also a lot of Catholics. Most of the Catholics would have felt more unity toward Ireland than they did Britain. However, in this industrial era, the looming threat of poverty had an absolute grip over the working class, meaning that many of them would just want to stay with Britain because of economic stability and opportunities. And so even as many Catholics living in Northern Ireland were treated like second-class citizens, many of them remained. And over time, this would create a tension. And there was one group of bros who weren't that happy about all this, and they considered Northern Ireland to be occupied territory.
I am a representative of the General Headquarters staff of Óglaigh na hÉireann, the IRA.
If the treaty were accepted, De Valera told one meeting, the fight for a republic would go on. They would get Irish freedom, even if they had to wade through Irish blood to do it.
Were you prepared to kill people?
I was prepared, yes.
I don't make any bones about killing. Anyone that comes into my house or my country and tries to take over by force, I'm going to kill him, and I'll use any and every means to do it.
Right, so post-treaty Ireland was considered a sovereign state under British domain. And as you can fucking imagine, there were some who didn't like that.
The terms of this agreement are in violent conflict with the wishes of the majority of this nation. I feel it is my duty to inform you immediately that I cannot recommend the acceptance of this treaty either to the Irish Parliament or to the country.
Both Sinn Féin, the political party, and the IRA were split into factions of pro-treaty and anti-treaty. So as you expect, bang, 922, civil war, straight out the gate. It's bloody, it's gory, it's not chill. They're all hacking themselves to pieces, but you have to ask the question, what about the people, man? Well, you see, the general public claimed, publicly, that they generally quite liked the pro-treaty side more. And you can see that because the pro-treaty Sinn Féin won the general election in 1922 and 1923. And so the Irish Free State would win this war against the IRA in 1923. And they decided this IRA lot, they're a bit annoying. So we're just gonna we're gonna squash them. 12,000 IRA members were interned, and many of the leaders were they were executed, is what I'm saying. And now with the IRA under control, Ireland could go on and live in peace and harmony and good vibes. Wrong. The IRA did shrink, but it didn't die, and they regrouped after this big incident and thought, what is the new meta? What's the new strat? And so they sniffed around, they saw where the wind was blowing, and they decided to become communists. Sort of. For a while, the IRA teamed up with the Soviet Union and would spy on America and Britain in exchange for about £500 a month, which when you adjust for inflation is about £26,000, which I'm going to say, compared to what the Kremlin were paying Tim Pool, I would say they got a pretty fucking good bargain. But you see, the IRA-Soviet collabo was a bit short-lived, and it was more of a utilitarian relationship. It'd be a bit of a reach to say that the IRA were really ardently communists. It was more a relationship of convenience. However, by 1937, the Irish Free State would become completely independent from Britain, declaring a new state called Ireland, or Ireland in English, which I guess now we refer to as the Republic of Ireland. The government in the 1930s would completely ban the IRA. However, you can't kill the IRA. It doesn't work like that. From here, they decided to put down the hammer and sickle and pick up a Swazi. They also said, hey, Hitler, if you want to, do a collabo, we could invade Britain for you, leading to even more of the IRA being interned and executed. However, the IRA still managed to regroup and basically did a coup d'etat on Sinn Féin, the political party, who had fallen out of popularity by now. Under new IRA leadership, they put down the fascism. That shit was donezo, and decided that now they wanted a Catholic state dictatorship. As I think you're probably coming to understand now, it seemed to me that the IRA really struggled to fully have a political vision. There was a lack of coherency behind their political views, and really it seemed as though they were more just obsessed with the idea of a united Ireland. And it seemed to be out of touch with a lot of the general public, who were probably more pro-treaty as it offered them stability that they could see. And very likely, deep in their hearts, they probably did yearn for a united Ireland. But at the end of the day, most people are just going to be happy with some food on the table.
How important would it be to you to see Ireland united?
Well, personally, I'm pretty happy with things as they are.
And you are a Northern Catholic?
Oh, yes.
But the IRA was fuming. They wouldn't give up. The IRA attacks had been few and far between, but it'd been 1956 where they would launch the border campaign. The goal here was mainly to bomb infrastructure in Northern Ireland. However, the campaign was a flop. It resulted in more IRA deaths than it did for the RUC, along with 400 IRA members being interned and 150 being interned in the Republic of Ireland. However, as we move into the 60s, the whole world was changing, and so too was Northern Ireland.
During the Northern Ireland border town was another scene of violence in a black weekend. What started as a peaceful civil rights march turned into a battlefield.
The 60s was a time for change. The civil rights movement swept the world, where you had young people with long hair who smelt terrible telling everyone that you shouldn't discriminate against people based on their religion or their race. And the Catholics in Northern Ireland heard all this. You hear this, right? They're fucking talking about us.
The organisers of the march did seem from the very start to have control of the thousands that had walked to Main Avenue on the Catholic Derrybeg estate.
Now you see, although the Catholics were a minority in Northern Ireland, from the 20s through to the 60s, their population share had increased. And they started to question the status quo, which was, why are Protestants just treated better than us? Why is it like that? And they weren't making this up, it was true. The Catholic unemployment rate was double that of Protestants. Catholics had far fewer of the upper tier occupations and the more profitable industries. They kind of had the shit jobs. And also, employment opportunities were more concentrated in Protestant areas, primarily due to the fact that governmental policies often were aimed at benefiting these areas. And on top of that, one of the most fucked things was the gerrymandering of the vote, whereby if you were a landowner or someone with a profession, a degree, etc., you literally had more votes than someone who wasn't, aka the Catholics.
Many local authorities like Derry, with Catholic majorities, had unionist councils. The device that ensured control by the minority was known as gerrymandering and involved drawing up the electoral boundaries in such a way as to favour one side.
The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association emerged in this period, and they were making some headway. A man by the name of Terence O'Neill. He was a Protestant Unionist Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. However, he wanted to reform Catholic rights. He wanted to make life better for them. In 1962, right, the IRA announced the end of the border campaign. This was massive, right? Because it was signaling that they wanted to move away from violence and towards politics.
The movement was relying too much on its military campaign, whereas I was always a bit worried, even at that stage, that you still had the problem of loyalism. While it looked like a religious question, it really wasn't. What's in it for the people?
You had a bunch of new young members in the IRA who were now more leaning towards Marxism. They wanted to change the IRA's overall view of the conflict between Catholics and Protestants, a sectarian conflict, and move it towards a more class-based vision. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There's no war but the class war. This ideological rift led to a split in the IRA, creating the Provisional Irish Republican Army. And many will point to this speech from Jimmy Still as like confirmation that it was all about ideology.
Today, in many places, pure and raw patriotism is frowned upon as its adherence to the policy of non-compromise and force. Indeed, one is now expected to be more conversant with the teachings of Chairman Mao than in those of our dead patriots.
However, many argue that this is a bit of a simplification. That yes, there was this ideological rift growing, however, the real split in the IRA came down to the handling of a very specific event in 1969.
Father in heaven, we bow before thee. We know that there is a conspiracy in this land to put us into jail. And we remember that Christ was taken from prison and from judgment.
A geezer by the name of Ian Paisley rocks up to fuck everything up. Now, Reverend Ian Paisley, he was a staunch unionist and he became the charismatic populist leader of the era, fighting against the Catholic civil rights movement.
I'm simply telling you that this parade is banned. We have always maintained that we work within the law and have always worked within the law, although Bernadette Devlin and the civil rights can do what they like.
Ian Paisley founded the Ulster Constitution Defence Committee, the UCDC. He also strapped up a bunch of paramilitaries, creating the Ulster Protestant Volunteers. They, plus the Northern Irish government, considered the civil rights movement an elaborate front for Republican and communist ideologies. And look, I'm going to be honest, their fears weren't like entirely irrational.
And we want to declare in this area what we want to see declared someday in the whole of the country, north and south. A workers' and farmers' socialist republic.
The NICRA did have members of the IRA in it. They had Republicans and nationalists and communists. However, they also had anti-communist left-wingers. In fact, they had Protestants, they had English people, and they had Irish people. You see, despite all their ideological differences, they were able to unite over the push for equal rights for Catholics. But the Unionists didn't see it that way.
Over the hills and valleys of Ulster, the voice of Protestant extremism. It belongs to the Reverend Ian Paisley, the leader of a new anti-Roman Catholic campaign that threatens to drag the 6 counties back into religious strife.
He has mastered the Hitlerian techniques of the constant repetition of certain cliches.
We as Protestants will welcome our honoured Queen because she is a Protestant monarch, sitting on a Protestant throne.
Ian Paisley went on a campaign of fear-mongering and stoking the paranoias of Unionists, leading to the 7th of May, 1966. In a Catholic-owned pub in the Loyalist area of Shankill in Belfast, Loyalists went in and petrol-bombed it, killing, ironically, the next-door neighbour who was an old lady and a Protestant. The group who did this attack was called the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, who proceeded with a campaign with groups like the Shankill Butchers to carry out random killings of Catholic civilians. He made Unionists feel that the Catholics were trying to destroy their way of life, and this led to an increasing radicalisation of Unionists.
Some Loyalist paramilitaries claimed that Ian Paisley's anti-Catholic rhetoric spurred them to violence.
From a military-style march.
On the 5th of October, 1968, a civil rights march is planned to take place in a very divided part of Northern Ireland. To the Unionists, they call it Londonderry, and to the Republicans, they call it Derry. Cathal Goulding, the IRA Chief of Staff, appeared on television saying that the IRA will be actively supporting the civil rights movement. This, as you can imagine, bolstered the fears within the Unionists. The Northern Ireland's Home Affairs Minister, William Craig, decided to ban the Civil Rights March, stating that he saw the NICRA as a Republican nationalist organisation. But despite this, the march went ahead with 400 protesters, and instantly they were attacked by the police with batons, leading to riots. Now, footage of this police brutality spread all around the world. This event is largely seen by historians as the beginning of the Troubles.
In Londonderry and other places recently, a minority of agitators determined to subvert lawful authority played a part in setting light to highly inflammable material. But the tinder for that fire, in the form of grievances, real or imaginary, had been piling up for years. And so I saw it as our duty to do two things.
Now, look, the government was in a very sticky scenario. So you had Terence O'Neill, he was still in charge, and he continued to announce reforms. However, as the temperature had changed and people had become more and more radicalized, the reforms were not enough for the most ardent of the civil rights movement. And they were way too much for the Unionists. And things just kept getting worse. In 1969, there was a series of bombs on Northern Irish infrastructure. And instantly, the blame was pinned on the IRA.
This explosion has interfered with the lives of thousands of the people in the Belfast area, and as a result, extensive additional security precautions have been taken. Police inquiries and forensic inquiries have been proceeding since first light. Investigations are still taking place. It is hoped that it will be possible to bring those responsible to justice.
Terence O'Neill lost control of his party and had to resign. The era of reform had come to an end. However, many years later, evidence would emerge that the bombing was not the IRA, but it was the UVF, planned deliberately to be blamed on the IRA in order to force out Terence O'Neill and to stop concessions to the Catholics.
Paisley had supplied the money to finance the Kilkeel explosion.
Involved with me, I don't know whether you can say that or not, but they were in organisations that I was leading. But I mean, I can't be responsible for everybody who is a member of a church that I pastor or an organisation which I lead.
And mate, it kept hotting up, right? So 1969 now, and there was a 3-day riot, the Battle of Bogside, which sounds like a lovely part of town. And it was becoming increasingly clear that the RUC, which is like the official Royal Ulster Constabulary, they were now struggling to keep control of the situation, right? A civil war was about to break out. And the Northern Irish government, called Stormont, were kind of desperate, and they had to holler the boys. I don't want to call them the boys, actually. I don't want to have any part in this. They contacted Westminster to bring in British troops.
How did the local people greet you when you came in?
As if we were rescuing them.
Yes, yeah. I hate to say liberators, but the rioting stopped.
All right, so the British Army rock up, right? They go to Derry/Londonderry and they put up a barricade between the Catholics and the Protestants. And voila, it was fixed. The rioting was over.
We didn't expect it to go on.
And to develop like it did.
We thought we'd ended it. It came in and it stopped.
But the problem is, right, okay, they stopped the rioting, but they didn't create a solution. On the 15th of August 1969, a load of Catholic houses on Bombay Street was set on fire by a loyalist mob.
The Falls Road area was devastated by gunfire and by petrol bombs.
Their houses had been burnt down by Unionists, but it was the IRA who got the blame, because many of the Catholics felt that the IRA had failed to protect them. And this would be the moment, the defining moment that led to the split between the old IRA and the PIRA.
Within the next 8 or 10 weeks, there will be, from the Revolutionary Irish Republican Army organisations, a new phase in violence against our country, which will attempt to give the impression of a general uprising.
From here, man, the acts of violence just continued to grow between Catholics and Protestants. And the British Army were increasingly put in a difficult position. They were supposed to be impartial to the conflict. They were supposed to be peacekeepers. However, it would be the imposing of the Fool's Curfew, where Catholics weren't allowed out after a certain time, that completely changed the dynamic of this conflict.
For the first time in nearly a year, the troops in Ulster were this weekend allowed to get tough. Their days of standing on the corners to take a bashing from both the mobs and the politicians might be over.
4 Catholic civilians were killed by the British Army for being out past this curfew. And overnight, this completely changed the perception of the British Army. No longer were they peacekeepers. Now they were the enemy of the IRA. So just imagine you're a Republican Catholic. You have the literal British Army on what you consider to be Irish soil telling you you're not allowed to leave your house at a certain time or we'll shoot you. This was like giving the IRA new recruits. And in response, the IRA escalated. They went on the attack. Now it wasn't just the Unionists that were in their sights. Now it was British Army officers.
Because of the Loyalist campaign, which was massive and assisted by the British government, there was retaliatory action taken.
And so these attacks went on, and it led to the British Army and the RUC taking a load of people that they suspected of being in the IRA and putting them in prison, which, as we know, historically, did not stop them. In the arrest of 342 Republicans, they killed 24 people. And it later turned out that most of these people they arrested were not terrorists. They were not involved in violence. And so now pretty much the entire Irish population was fully against the British.
The honeymoon period cannot, I do not think, continue forever, obviously. Unless there is a solution or some hope for the future, the soldiers are not going to be welcomed on the streets for forever and ever.
On January the 30th, 1972, a civil rights march through the centre of Londonderry culminated in one of the darkest episodes of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The events of Bloody Sunday would come to define the conflict for many and leave a lasting legacy of bitterness and injustice.
After Bloody Sunday, where the British Army shot 26 unarmed civilians, including one 15-year-old boy during a civil rights march, the Northern Irish Stormont government would be dissolved in 1972. The chaos broke down the government, and the IRA obviously saw that as a win, as now the Unionist-controlled government didn't have power over Northern Ireland anymore. And so the UVF and other paramilitaries went on a series of killings of Catholics, and now it was just all-out war.
Bloody Sunday, that was effectively the end of the civil rights, and then you're into a full-blown guerrilla warfare.
From here, the IRA would split into a number of factions because they didn't always get along. And it was quite a unique conflict because it wasn't big superpowers where they have the whole engine of the state to fund it. They were paramilitaries. They were kind of like just groups of lads. Both Unionists and Republicans would move their campaign into different areas. Some through legitimate political action, and others through like organized crime, major drug dealing networks, smuggling arms from America, and interestingly, Colonel Gaddafi's Libya. And each side were just becoming increasingly violent and vicious. From Bloody Friday, where the PRA planted 20 bombs, killing 9 people and wounding 130, to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings by the Unionists, which killed 34 people. The conflict turned into like this tit-for-tat rivalry, and the borders that split the Catholics and Protestants in Belfast got bigger and bigger. But it would only be a matter of time before this war found its way onto British soil.
That autumn, IRA bombs brought death and devastation on an entirely new scale to England.
In 1979, Lord Mountbatten, the cousin to the Queen, was killed by an IRA bomb.
It's quite obvious from the injuries to the bodies that Earl Mountbatten and the 15-year-old boy, Paul Maxwell, took the brunt of the blast on last Monday.
And like, you know, as the British public, we don't know the ins and outs of this conflict. We just see what we see on television. And we were fucking pissed. You just killed the royal family and we love them lot. Sort of. Thatcher, when she came into power, she took a very hardline stance against the PIRA. They, in turn, tried to bomb her.
Mrs. Thatcher had been working in her suite when it happened. Apart from the wrecked bathroom, all the glass and mirrors in the bedroom were smashed. Police said the Prime Minister remained icy cool throughout.
Margaret Thatcher only narrowly survived. unfortunately. Probably shouldn't say that, I'll get on a list or something. No longer was the conflict just in Northern Ireland and parts of the Republic of Ireland. The bombings on British soil now brought the British public into this conflict, resulting in a strong anti-Irish sentiment sweeping across Britain.
A guy rang up and said if the bombing campaign didn't stop in 7 days, they were going to launch a foot and mouth disease in Ireland.
We don't see any sort of solution in the near future. Send them all back and let them blow each other up.
At the end of the day, these are civilians, and more civilians' lives are being lost because of this conflict, and they're being dragged into it. And it went on for 30 years. And like, you can have sympathy for where the conflict started with the discrimination of Catholics. You can have sympathy for that. But as time goes by and the conflict spreads out, it just becomes something different, with all sides doing horrific things, including the British Army. And so eventually things would have to change.
So what you and I have got to do is get involved. You and I have to be right there breathing down their throat. Every time they look over their shoulder, we want them to see us. It's going to be the ballot or the bullet.
For many of the Republicans, there was a hardline stance against involving themselves in politics because they didn't see the government as legitimate. However, in 1981, a bunch of prisoners, Republican prisoners of war, embarked on a hunger strike, as well as what was called a dirty strike, which I'll let you Google what that is. During this strike, a geezer called Bobby Sands, who was one of the members of the IRA who was on this strike, he was elected as an MP in Westminster.
Sands Bobby, political prisoner, 30,492. I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency.
And then he died on day 66 of this strike, along with 9 other people. Their deaths unleashed a ton of rage at Thatcher and gained a ton of support for the IRA, but this time they aimed for political change.
And the by-election which followed the death of Bobby Sands showed that public support was not merely an emotional reaction. Several hunger strikers and protesting prisoners stood in the election, and Kieran Doherty was elected as TD for Cavan Monaghan.
The alleged IRA leader, I have to say alleged because he's never admitted it, his name was Gerry Adams, and he became an MP for West Belfast via the party Sinn Féin. Gerry Adams broke the PIRA tradition of abstentionism, which means just to not take your political seat. You can win the election, but you don't sit and involve yourself. And he opted to move towards trying to broker a peace deal, despite at the same time allegedly ordering the deaths of IRA spies and informants. But you know, just ignore that.
We have always been critical privately and have never attempted to condone any operations which have led to civilian casualties or led to civilian deaths. Ultimately, the responsibility for all of these deaths lies with the British government.
Leading to April 1998, a number of unionist parties, along with their paramilitary links, agreed with nationalist parties and their paramilitary links to sign the Good Friday Agreement. I don't know why, the Troubles just has some of the hardest fucking names for things. Bloody Sunday, Good Friday Agreement, the Troubles. I don't know who did their marketing, but give that man a raise. And so in 1998, the Troubles had officially come to an end. The agreement was never perfect, but it had 3 main principles. That Northern Ireland won't become part of the Republic of Ireland unless it is done so by a vote of the people. Secondly, they wanted equal rights for Republicans and Loyalists. And thirdly, they wanted the freedom for the individuals of Northern Ireland to identify as either English, Irish, or both. Overwhelmingly, the public voted yes to this deal. And peace had been achieved. Sort of. I mean, there was a load of other fuck shit that happened, but largely, peace had been achieved. In 2007, Operation Banner came to a close, going down as the British Army's longest ever war of 38 years. All in all, the war cost 3.5 thousand lives. The economic cost, some would say the direct violence cost about 14 billion. However, the indirect economic costs of a nation at war is estimated to have had an effect on the GDP by about 15 to 20%. That's massive. Although generally now there is peace in Northern Ireland, there are still flare-ups that go on from time to time. Like, these paramilitary groups still exist. Some work as like unofficial police forces in certain areas. Sectarianism and segregation still does exist. The walls in Northern Ireland are still there dividing those communities. And opinion polls show that the Northern Irish are still divided on the topic of a united Ireland. And after Brexit happened, which collapsed the Stormont government because Northern Ireland majoritively voted to remain in the EU, the situation isn't solved and it is volatile. However, a generation called the Peace Babies, born after the Good Friday Agreement, seem to largely be detached from the conflict. They've grown up their whole lives and just saw people as people.
The reality of Northern Ireland is everywhere you go, you're going to be with someone who's a different religion than you, who has different ideas from you, and that's what you have to accept and move on from.
But really, to me, after learning about this whole topic, it's hard to not just see how sectarianism, this tribalism, spawned out of really a long era of economic problems, and populists and radicals stoking the flames for their own interests whilst kind of ignoring the interests of the people, the working people who are the most impacted by all of this. Because the truth is, at the end of the day, right, a lot of these people that got tied up in these conflicts were just working class people, where in reality both the poor Catholics and poor Protestants were equally living shit lives. Our differences as people are always the things that these types of people target. And until you address those living standards that create the conditions for this kind of thing to happen, society will always risk falling back into division and conflict.
In Dungannon in 1963, there were over 300 families on the waiting list for a house, and no Catholic had been allocated a permanent house for 34 years. How unacceptable was that?
Unacceptable at all.
Was that British justice?
No, it wasn't justice at all.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and jump in the Discord where we can talk about this and much more. Peace.